Commander Marcus Kane had perfected the art of existing without truly living during 20 years of solitary duty aboard Epsilon 7, a deep space monitoring station positioned so far beyond the frontier that rescue missions took months to reach him and supply runs arrived annually if the logistics coordinators remembered his remote posting existed. The isolation was intentional, a self-imposed exile that kept him functional by eliminating the possibility of forming connections that could be severed by the kind of violence that had destroyed everything he'd once valued about his life. The station's daily routine had become his salvation and his prison. Equipment diagnostics at 0600, sensor array calibrations at 0800, data analysis and transmission at 1200, maintenance protocols at 1600, and personal time that he filled with technical manuals, engineering projects, and carefully controlled exercise routines that kept his body functional without requiring interaction with other human beings. 20 years of this schedule had worn grooves in his psyche as deep as the maintenance pathways he walked through the station's corridors, creating a life that was predictable, manageable, and empty of the emotional vulnerability that had once made him an effective military commander. The proximity alarms that shattered his morning routine were the first unscheduled interruption he'd experienced in 6 months, and Marcus's response was automatic: check sensor readings, analyze threat parameters, prepare defense protocols if necessary, and notify command of any situation requiring intervention. What the sensors detected was an unknown vessel on collision course with the asteroid that housed his station, its trajectory suggesting mechanical failure rather than hostile approach, though Marcus's 20 years of paranoid caution made him verify weapon signatures before concluding that he was dealing with an accident rather than an attack. The crash was spectacular enough to register on his seismic monitors, a ship of unfamiliar design that carved a debris trail across the asteroid's surface before coming to rest in a crater that his sensors indicated was deep enough to make survivor extraction challenging even if anyone had survived the impact. Marcus's first instinct was to file an incident report and let search and rescue operations handle whatever consequences resulted from ships traveling through uncharted space without proper navigation equipment. His second instinct, barely acknowledged after 2 decades of suppressing protective impulses, was to check for life signs. The bioscanners detected a single survivor in the wreckage, injured but stable, trapped but not immediately dying, requiring assistance that Marcus was technically equipped to provide, though he'd spent 20 years avoiding situations that would require him to take responsibility for another person's welfare. The logical response was to maintain safe distance and wait for proper rescue operations. The human response, buried under 20 years of careful emotional isolation, was to gear up for crater descent and survivor extraction. Marcus stood in his equipment bay for 10 minutes, staring at the rescue gear he'd maintained but never used, while his carefully constructed psychological barriers warred with instincts that his military training had ingrained too deeply to completely eliminate. The survivor's life signs were weakening. Not immediately critical, but deteriorating in ways that suggested time was a factor in determining whether rescue operations would recover a living being or process remains for family notification. "Damn," Marcus muttered, the first word he'd spoken aloud in 3 weeks, as he began pulling on environmental gear that would allow him to operate in the crater's harsh conditions. The survivor was female, humanoid but clearly not human. Her skin held a silver-blue tint that suggested adaptation to different atmospheric conditions, her ears curved to elegant points, and her build combined human proportions with the kind of dense muscle definition that indicated enhanced physical capabilities. She was unconscious when Marcus found her, but his emergency medical training detected injuries that were painful rather than life-threatening, assuming she received proper treatment within the next few hours. Getting her back to the station required engineering improvisation that Marcus hadn't needed to attempt in decades, but his technical expertise remained intact despite disuse, and he managed to extract both the survivor and enough of her personal equipment to ensure she wouldn't wake up completely isolated from familiar objects. The unconscious woman's face held the kind of fierce beauty that suggested someone accustomed to command or combat, and Marcus found himself noting details: the way her silver hair seemed to hold internal light, the elegant bone structure that combined delicate features with obvious strength, that he hadn't allowed himself to register about another person in 20 years. Focus on medical protocols, he told himself as he established her in the station's medical bay, using equipment that felt unfamiliar after decades of treating only his own minor injuries. Stabilize, monitor, report to command, wait for proper rescue operations. But as he worked to ensure her injuries were properly treated and her vital signs remained stable, Marcus realized that having another consciousness aboard his station was going to disrupt the carefully controlled isolation that had kept him functional for 2 decades. When she woke up, there would be conversations, questions about his circumstances and her situation, social interaction that would require him to function as something more than a maintenance technician for remote monitoring equipment. The woman stirred as he was completing her medical assessment, her eyes opening to reveal the kind of alert intelligence that immediately assessed her surroundings, her condition, and the person who had extracted her from wreckage that should have been fatal. When she spoke, her voice carried accents that suggested a language family Marcus didn't recognize, though her words were in perfectly clear standard. "You pulled me out of the crash," she said, not a question but a statement that suggested someone accustomed to analyzing situations quickly and drawing accurate conclusions. "Yes," Marcus replied, falling back on minimal communication that had served him during supply run interactions and annual inspection visits. "Your station, you operated alone?" "Yes." She studied his face with the kind of careful assessment that Marcus recognized as professional evaluation, though he couldn't determine what criteria she was using to measure his responses. 20 years, she said, and Marcus felt his carefully controlled expression shift despite his efforts to maintain neutral composure. "How did you? The way you move, the way you've organized everything for single-person efficiency, the complete absence of social protocols in your speech patterns." Her silver hair caught the medical bay's lighting as she shifted position, testing her mobility despite obvious discomfort from her injuries. "I'm Zara of the Kithari Reconnaissance Corps. And you are someone who has spent a very long time avoiding exactly this kind of interaction." Marcus stared at the woman whose crash had shattered his carefully maintained isolation, realizing that her warrior training and enhanced perceptual abilities meant that his psychological barriers would be considerably less effective than they'd been during his infrequent interactions with human personnel who were too busy with their own duties to analyze his personal history. "Commander Marcus Kane," he said finally, offering information because her directness seemed to require honest response rather than evasive deflection. "And yes, I've been avoiding this kind of interaction for 20 years. By choice or circumstance?" The question carried the weight of someone who understood that solitude could be refuge as well as prison, and Marcus found himself considering an answer that went beyond the standard explanations he'd given to supervisors who questioned his posting preferences. "By choice," he said. "Because circumstances taught me that some kinds of interaction cost more than I can afford to pay." Zara's expression shifted to something that looked like understanding mixed with warrior's respect for battle damage that went beyond physical injury. "And now circumstances have brought interaction to you whether you chose it or not." "Now," Marcus agreed, "we wait for rescue operations to extract you from a situation that doesn't require extended social contact with someone who's forgotten how to function around other people." "Marcus Kane," Zara said, using his name with the kind of careful pronunciation that suggested she understood its importance despite cultural differences, "how long do you expect rescue operations to take?" Marcus checked his communication equipment, running calculations he'd been avoiding since completing her medical treatment. 3 to 6 weeks, depending on search patterns and resource allocation for remote station emergencies. Zara's smile carried the kind of grim humor that warriors developed when facing challenges that couldn't be solved through direct action. "Then it appears we have considerable time to discover whether 20 years of avoiding interaction has actually prepared you for the kind of extended contact that survival requires." As Marcus realized that his carefully constructed isolation was about to be tested by someone whose cultural background emphasized directness and honesty over the polite social deflection that had protected him during his infrequent human encounters, he wondered whether rescue would arrive soon enough to preserve the psychological barriers that had kept him functional, or whether Zara's presence would force him to confront aspects of himself that he'd spent 2 decades learning to suppress. 3 days into what would prove to be the most challenging psychological endurance test of Marcus's carefully isolated existence, he discovered that Kithari directness extended far beyond simple conversation into areas of personal inquiry that his defensive mechanisms were poorly equipped to handle. Zara had recovered from her injuries with the kind of rapid healing that suggested enhanced physiology, and her grateful cooperation with medical treatment had evolved into curiosity about the man who operated a deep space station with the kind of technical precision that impressed even someone whose warrior training included advanced technology systems. "Marcus," she said during their morning meal, a routine that had developed naturally as her recovery progressed, though Marcus was still adjusting to the presence of another person in spaces that had been exclusively his for 20 years. "Your technical expertise is remarkable, but your social skills suggest someone who actively avoids rather than simply lacks experience with interpersonal interaction." "That's an accurate assessment," Marcus replied, recognizing that evasion would be futile with someone whose cultural background emphasized direct communication over diplomatic politeness. In Kithari culture, capable individuals seek partnership and community because strength is enhanced rather than diminished by connection with others who share compatible goals and values. Zara's silver-blue skin seemed to capture the station's artificial lighting as she spoke, creating subtle color shifts that Marcus was beginning to recognize as indicators of her emotional state. "Your isolation suggests either philosophical disagreement with that principle or experience that taught you to associate connection with vulnerability rather than strength." Marcus set down his coffee cup, processing the way she'd managed to identify the core of his psychological framework with casual precision that cut through 20 years of carefully constructed rationalization. "Experience," he said finally. "Connection with vulnerability. Military experience. Command experience. Leading people I cared about into situations where my tactical decisions determined whether they survived to see their families again." Marcus paused, surprised by how easily the admission had emerged despite decades of avoiding such discussions. "I made decisions that got good people killed, and discovered that caring deeply about someone makes their loss exponentially more devastating than losing acquaintances or strangers." Zara was quiet for a moment, her enhanced perceptual abilities apparently processing information beyond his words. "How many people were under your command during the engagement that ended your military service?" 43, Marcus replied automatically, then felt surprise at how readily he'd provided specific information that he'd never shared with debriefing officers or psychological evaluators. 43 people who trusted me to bring them home, and who died because my tactical analysis was inadequate for the situation we encountered. "And you've spent 20 years in isolation because you concluded that your capacity for leadership was fatally flawed?" "I've spent 20 years in isolation because I discovered that I don't have the psychological strength to survive losing people I care about, and the only way to avoid future loss is to avoid future connection." Marcus met her eyes directly, recognizing that her directness was encouraging reciprocal honesty. "It's not a noble or sophisticated philosophy, but it's kept me functional when alternative approaches would have left me completely non-functional." "Marcus," Zara said, her voice carrying the kind of gentle firmness that warriors used when addressing wounded comrades, "what was the nature of the engagement that resulted in casualties among your personnel?" The question opened psychological territory that Marcus had spent 20 years avoiding, but something about Zara's warrior background and obvious respect for military experience made the memories feel manageable rather than overwhelming. Proxima War, final offensive against separatist forces that had fortified themselves in the outer colonies. Intelligence reports indicated standard defensive positions, minimal technological advantages, conventional tactical challenges. But the actual situation was different. The actual situation involved experimental weapons technology that our intelligence networks hadn't detected, defensive capabilities that exceeded our worst-case scenario projections, and enemy tactical coordination that suggested advanced knowledge of our operational plans. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied memories of decisions made with incomplete information. "My people died because I led them into a trap that proper intelligence gathering might have detected. Or because enemy forces possessed advantages that no amount of intelligence gathering could have anticipated," Zara suggested. In Kithari military tradition, commanders are responsible for making optimal decisions based on available information, not for possessing prescient knowledge about concealed enemy capabilities. Marcus studied her expression, noting the way her silver hair seemed to brighten when she spoke about military philosophy, and the confidence with which she addressed concepts that his own military training had never provided frameworks for processing. "Your culture has different approaches to command responsibility and acceptable losses." Kithari culture recognizes that warfare involves unavoidable uncertainties, and that even optimal tactical decisions can result in casualties when enemy forces possess concealed advantages or when situational factors exceed reasonable predictive capabilities. Zara's posture straightened with the kind of formal dignity that suggested she was sharing important cultural knowledge rather than offering casual comfort. Commanders who make decisions based on sound tactical analysis and genuine concern for their personnel are honored regardless of outcomes that result from factors beyond their control. And commanders who make decisions that result in avoidable casualties are expected to learn from their mistakes and apply that knowledge to future decisions, assuming they demonstrated competence and proper intent during the engagement in question. Zara's smile carried warmth that made her alien features seem both exotic and remarkably familiar. Self-imposed exile is considered a waste of hard-earned experience that could benefit other warriors facing similar challenges. Over the following days, their conversations continued to explore the intersection between Marcus's human psychological responses to trauma and Zara's Kithari cultural frameworks for processing violence and loss. Her warrior training provided perspectives on leadership, sacrifice, and acceptable risk that gradually penetrated his defensive isolation, while his technical expertise and careful attention to her needs during recovery demonstrated character traits that her culture valued highly in potential partners. Marcus, Zara said during their evening meal routine, now a comfortable tradition that both looked forward to despite their different reasons for appreciating regular conversation. May I ask you something about human social behavior that puzzles me? Of course. Your technical skills, your protective instincts during my medical treatment, your obvious intelligence and capacity for strategic thinking, all of these suggest someone who would be valued highly as a partner in Kithari society. Her silver-blue skin shifted through color patterns that Marcus was learning to recognize as curiosity mixed with genuine interest. But you've chosen 20 years of solitude over the possibility of finding someone compatible with your personality and goals. Is this because humans associate partnership with weakness rather than enhanced strength? Marcus considered her question while studying the way her pointed ears moved with subtle expressions of attention, and the alien grace that made her presence aboard his station feel both disruptive and oddly natural. Humans associate partnership with vulnerability to loss, and some of us decide that the potential benefits don't justify the guaranteed risk of eventual separation through death, disagreement, or circumstances beyond our control. And you've concluded that the risk of loss outweighs the potential benefits of connection? I concluded that I personally lack the emotional resilience to survive losing someone I care deeply about a second time, Marcus corrected. It's not a universal human trait. It's a personal limitation that I've chosen to manage through avoidance rather than attempting to overcome through repeated exposure to potential loss. Zara was quiet for several minutes, her enhanced perceptual abilities apparently processing not just his words but emotional states that human senses couldn't detect. When she finally spoke, her voice carried something that sounded like warrior's respect mixed with gentle challenge. Marcus Kane, she said, what if you encountered someone strong enough to share the risk rather than requiring you to bear responsibility for their welfare alone? The question hung in the station's recycled air while Marcus processed implications that cut to the heart of assumptions he'd built his life around for 20 years. Looking at Zara's expression, intelligent, confident, and somehow both patient and expectant, he began to wonder whether his self-imposed exile had been protection or simply postponement of challenges that would eventually require different solutions than strategic avoidance. I don't know, he said finally, offering honesty that felt more dangerous than any tactical decision he'd made during his military career. I've spent 20 years avoiding that possibility because I assumed it was too dangerous to explore. Perhaps, Zara suggested with a smile that brightened her alien features in ways that made Marcus understand why his psychological defenses felt increasingly inadequate. The next few weeks will provide opportunity to discover whether some risks are worth taking despite the potential for loss they represent. 2 weeks into their unexpected cohabitation, Marcus found himself experiencing something that felt suspiciously like contentment, an emotional state he'd actively avoided for 20 years because contentment implied connection, and connection implied vulnerability to loss that he'd sworn never to risk again. But Zara's presence aboard Epsilon 7 had transformed his carefully controlled isolation into something that resembled partnership, with daily routines that accommodated both his need for structure and her warrior's appreciation for competence and reliability. The atmospheric processor is showing stress indicators, Zara observed during their morning equipment check, her enhanced senses detecting system irregularities that Marcus's instruments were only beginning to register. Power fluctuations in the secondary circuits, and something that feels like vibration in the deck plating near the main recycling units. Feels like vibration? Marcus asked, though he'd learned to trust her perceptual abilities during their weeks of working together to maintain station operations. Kithury's sensory enhancement includes tactile sensitivity that detects structural stress through floor contact, she explained, kneeling to place her palms against the deck plating with the kind of focused attention that Marcus had observed during her technical analyses. There's definitely mechanical stress in the life support systems that your sensors haven't registered yet. Marcus pulled up diagnostic displays that confirmed her assessment. The atmospheric processor was indeed developing problems that would become critical within days if not addressed immediately. The repairs would require access to confined spaces that his bulky frame could navigate but not work inefficiently, while Zara's enhanced physical capabilities and smaller stature made her ideally suited for the technical work that would be necessary. I'll need to shut down secondary life support while we make repairs, Marcus said, calculating the risks involved in operating with reduced environmental redundancy. Are you comfortable working in confined spaces with limited air circulation? Kithury physiology includes enhanced oxygen efficiency, Zara replied with the kind of calm confidence that had made their technical collaboration surprisingly effective. I can function in environments that would challenge human respiratory systems, assuming you can talk me through the repair procedures. What followed was 6 hours of the most intense cooperative work Marcus had experienced since his military service, Zara's physical capabilities guided by his technical expertise, with both of them problem-solving in real time as they discovered complications that standard maintenance procedures hadn't anticipated. Her warrior training included mechanical aptitude that complemented his engineering knowledge, while his patient instruction style accommodated her direct communication preferences without the kind of social friction that might have complicated their work under stress. Marcus, Zara called from deep within the atmospheric processing unit, her voice muffled by the confined space but still carrying the kind of controlled urgency that indicated significant problems. The damage is more extensive than we anticipated. I'm seeing stress fractures in primary support structures that suggest this isn't normal equipment failure, this looks like impact damage from my crash landing. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized that Zara's presence on his station had inadvertently created the crisis they were now struggling to resolve. Are you saying that rescuing you endangered the life support systems that keep us both alive? I'm saying that crash landing on your asteroid has caused system failures that neither of us could have anticipated, she corrected with characteristic directness. And that accepting responsibility for situations beyond our control is counterproductive when we need to focus on solutions rather than blame assignment. Her response carried the kind of practical wisdom that Marcus recognized from his own military training, though he'd spent 20 years forgetting how to apply such principles to personal situations rather than just technical problems. As they continued working together to repair systems that would determine whether they survived the weeks remaining before rescue operations could reach them, Marcus found himself functioning with the kind of focused competence that he'd thought was permanently lost along with his capacity for caring about outcomes that affected other people. Zara, he said during a brief break while waiting for replacement components to cool enough for installation, I need to ask you something about Kithury cultural attitudes toward acceptable risk in partnership situations. Ask, she replied, settling beside him in the cramped maintenance area with the kind of comfortable proximity that had developed naturally during their weeks of cooperation. Your culture values connection and partnership, but you're also warriors who understand that caring about someone increases the emotional impact of losing them. Marcus studied her expression, noting the way her silver hair seemed to brighten when she focused on serious conversations. How do Kithury reconcile the contradiction between seeking meaningful bonds and protecting themselves from the devastation of loss? We don't consider it a contradiction, Zara said, her voice carrying the kind of gentle certainty that suggested deeply held cultural beliefs. Kithury philosophy recognizes that loss is inevitable regardless of whether we choose connection or isolation, but that shared experiences create meaning that transcends individual survival. Meaning that transcends survival? Marcus, you've spent 20 years in isolation to protect yourself from losing people you care about, she said, moving closer with the kind of natural intimacy that had developed as they'd learned to work together effectively. But you lost those 43 soldiers anyway, and avoiding future connections hasn't restored them to life or eliminated the pain of their absence. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied thoughts about his lost command, but Zara's proximity and obvious understanding made the memories feel manageable rather than overwhelming. So Kithri accept the risk of loss because avoiding it doesn't actually prevent loss from occurring? We accept the risk because the alternative, existing without meaningful connection, is a form of death that occurs while you're still breathing, she replied. And because facing challenges together creates strength that neither individual could possess alone. Even when facing challenges together might result in losing both lives instead of just one. Especially then, Zara said with a smile that made her alien features seem both exotic and somehow familiar. Because some experiences are valuable enough that sharing them justifies whatever risks such sharing might entail. As they returned to their repair work, Marcus found himself processing not just Zara's cultural philosophy but the way their partnership during the crisis had felt natural despite his 20 years of avoiding exactly this kind of collaborative interdependence. Her warrior's strength and his technical expertise had combined to create solutions that neither could have developed independently, while the trust required for their cooperation had developed without the kind of conscious decision-making that his defensive mechanisms typically demanded. Zara, he said as they completed the final system tests that would determine whether their repairs had been successful, what happens when rescue operations arrive and extract you from this situation? Do you return to your reconnaissance duties, and I return to 20 years of isolation interrupted by one brief period of effective partnership? That depends, she replied, checking readings that would indicate whether the atmospheric processor was functioning within normal parameters, on whether you've discovered that some forms of connection enhance rather than threaten your capacity to function effectively under challenging circumstances. The system diagnostics confirmed that their repairs had been successful, but Marcus realized that the more significant test would be determining whether the partnership they'd developed during crisis could survive the transition to normal operations, or whether his psychological defenses would reassert themselves once the immediate threat to their survival had been resolved. I think I'm beginning to understand what you meant about facing challenges together creating strength that neither individual could possess alone, he said, watching Zara's expression brighten with something that looked like hope mixed with warrior's respect for honest self-assessment. And I'm beginning to understand that 20 years of technical expertise and strategic thinking haven't been wasted during your isolation, she replied. They've been preparation for partnership with someone who appreciates both your capabilities and your caution about risking them in relationships that might not justify such investment. As they secured the repair areas and returned to their quarters for rest after the most intensive cooperative effort Marcus had attempted in 2 decades, he found himself wondering whether rescue would arrive too soon to allow full exploration of possibilities that were only beginning to develop between them, or whether some connections were strong enough to survive whatever transitions the future might require. 3 weeks after her crash landing, as they waited for rescue signals that seemed increasingly theoretical, Zara found Marcus in the station's observation deck during his evening routine, 30 minutes of staring at the star field while processing the day's events and preparing for another night of sleep that had become surprisingly peaceful since her arrival. The isolation that had once felt like protective solitude now felt incomplete without her presence, though Marcus was still processing the implications of psychological changes that challenged 20 years of carefully maintained emotional barriers. Marcus, Zara said, settling beside him with the kind of comfortable familiarity that had developed during their weeks of shared crisis management and daily routine coordination, I need to tell you something about Kithri bonding customs that might affect how you interpret our partnership. I'm listening, Marcus replied, though something in her tone suggested that the conversation would venture into territory that his defensive mechanisms were poorly equipped to handle. In Kithri culture, warriors who survive life-threatening situations together are considered bond-tested in ways that normal social interaction cannot provide, she said, her silver-blue skin shifting through color patterns that Marcus had learned to recognize as complex emotional processing. The trust, cooperation, and mutual dependence we've developed during our time together would be understood by my people as evidence of compatibility that transcends species differences. Marcus studied her expression, noting the way her pointed ears moved with subtle indicators of attention and the confidence with which she addressed concepts that his own cultural background had never provided frameworks for understanding. Bond-tested meaning. Meaning that we've demonstrated our ability to function as partners under circumstances that reveal character traits and capabilities that normal courtship interaction never exposes, Zara explained. Your technical expertise, protective instincts, and capacity for strategic thinking under pressure, combined with your patience in teaching me systems that my warrior training hadn't covered, these qualities indicate someone who would be valued highly as a life partner in Kithari society. And from my perspective, your physical capabilities, direct communication style, and warrior's approach to problem-solving have made our partnership more effective than any collaboration I've experienced during my military career, Marcus replied. But Zara, I've spent 20 years learning to function alone because I concluded that I lacked the emotional resilience to survive losing someone I care deeply about. Have you considered, she said, moving closer with the kind of natural intimacy that had developed as they'd learned to anticipate each other's needs and responses, that your fear of loss might be based on assuming responsibility for protecting people who were capable of protecting themselves? What do you mean? Marcus, during our weeks together, you've treated me as a partner rather than someone requiring protection from challenges I couldn't handle independently. Zara's voice carried the kind of gentle certainty that suggested she'd been thinking about this conversation for some time. You've shared technical knowledge, trusted me with critical repair work, and cooperated with my cultural needs without trying to manage outcomes that were beyond your control. Marcus processed her observation while studying the way starlight seemed to collect in her silver hair, and the alien grace that had transformed his sterile station into something that felt like a home shared with someone whose presence enhanced rather than complicated his daily existence. You're suggesting that my military trauma resulted from accepting responsibility for soldiers' welfare rather than trusting them to take responsibility for their own survival during combat? I'm suggesting that partnership with someone who doesn't require protection from their own decisions might feel different than command responsibility for people whose survival depended on your tactical choices, she said. And that your capacity for caring about someone might not be the vulnerability you've assumed it was. Before Marcus could respond, Zara stood and moved to the observation deck's main viewport, her reflection visible against the star field as she spoke words that would reshape his understanding of everything that had developed between them. You know what to do, human, she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of quiet confidence that warriors used when stating obvious conclusions that others might be reluctant to acknowledge. Marcus froze, his heart rate spiking as he processed the implications of her statement and the way she was looking at him, not with expectation or demand, but with patient certainty that suggested she understood something about his feelings that he was still struggling to accept. Zara, he began, then stopped as 20 years of defensive mechanisms collided with the recognition that she was right. He did know what to do. He'd known for days, possibly weeks, as their partnership had evolved from necessary cooperation into something that felt like the most natural relationship he'd ever experienced. The knowledge terrified him because it involved exactly the kind of emotional vulnerability that he'd spent 2 decades learning to avoid. You know, she continued, turning to face him with the kind of direct gaze that made evasion impossible, that what we've built together during these weeks is exactly what you've been afraid to hope for since losing your soldiers. Partnership with someone strong enough to share risks rather than requiring protection from them. Marcus stood slowly, his body moving toward her despite his mind's continued processing of implications that challenged every assumption he'd built his isolated life around. You're saying that I know I want to be with you, but I'm afraid to act on that knowledge because it means accepting the risk of eventually losing you. I'm saying that you already care deeply about me, and that avoiding acknowledgement of those feelings doesn't protect you from the loss you're trying to prevent, Zara replied, her silver blue skin shifting through color patterns that Marcus had learned indicated both confidence and gentle affection. The risk of loss exists regardless of whether we choose to build something together or maintain the careful distance that you've been trying to preserve. But choosing to build something together makes the potential loss more devastating when it eventually occurs. Or, Zara said, reaching out to take his hand with the kind of natural gesture that had characterized their growing intimacy. It makes whatever time we have together meaningful enough that the experience justifies whatever risk such meaning might entail. Marcus felt the warmth of her touch and the way her alien features had become completely familiar during their weeks of partnership, while his carefully constructed psychological barriers continued their losing battle against feelings that had been growing stronger despite his efforts to contain them. "Zara, I don't know if I'm strong enough to survive losing you if I let myself care as deeply as I want to," he admitted, the words carrying honesty that felt both terrifying and liberating. "Marcus Kane," she said, moving closer until he could see the subtle patterns in her luminescent skin and the way her pointed ears expressed emotions that human features couldn't convey, "you've already survived losing 43 people you cared about during the worst circumstances imaginable. What makes you think you lack the strength to build something beautiful with someone who's choosing to share that risk with you?" The truth of her statement cut through 20 years of rationalization and self-protection, leaving Marcus facing the recognition that his isolation hadn't protected him from pain, it had simply prevented him from discovering whether healing was possible when shared with someone who understood both his capabilities and his fears. "I know what to do," he said finally, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from accepting truth he'd been avoiding rather than discovering new information. "I know that I want to build something with you that goes beyond crisis partnership or temporary companionship while we wait for rescue." "And what is it that you want to build?" Zara asked, though her expression suggested she already understood his answer. "A life together," Marcus replied, the words feeling both natural and revolutionary as he spoke them aloud. "Partnership that combines your warrior strength with my technical expertise, your cultural wisdom with my strategic thinking, your directness with my caution, in ways that create something neither of us could achieve independently. Even knowing that such partnership involves the risk of eventual loss. Especially knowing that," Marcus said, reaching up to touch her face with the kind of gentle reverence that acknowledged both her alien beauty and the courage required to trust someone with his carefully guarded emotional vulnerability. "Because you've taught me that avoiding the risk of loss doesn't prevent loss from occurring, it just prevents meaning from developing during whatever time we're given." Zara's response was to move into his arms with the kind of natural grace that made their height difference irrelevant and their species differences feel like complementary variations rather than fundamental incompatibilities. When she kissed him, Marcus understood that 20 years of isolation had indeed been preparation rather than permanent exile, preparation for partnership with someone strong enough to help him carry burdens that had seemed too heavy to bear alone. "When rescue ships arrive," Zara said against his lips, "I want them to find partners who've decided to build a future together rather than individuals who happen to survive the same crisis." "When rescue ships arrive," Marcus agreed, "they'll find two people who discovered that the best relationships develop when someone is brave enough to risk everything for the possibility of finding someone worth risking everything for." 6 weeks later, the rescue ship Meridian arrived at Epsilon 7 to find Commander Marcus Kane submitting transfer requests that would allow him to accompany Zara back to areas of space where his technical expertise could support her reconnaissance work, while she had submitted applications for extended partnership assignments that would keep them working together as a team. "Commander Kane," said Captain Torres as she reviewed the paperwork that would end Marcus's 20-year isolation posting, "are you certain you want to return to active duty after so many years of independent operation?" "Captain," Marcus replied, looking at Zara whose warrior's confidence had become the foundation for his own rediscovered courage, "I'm certain that 20 years of preparation has led me to exactly where I need to be, with exactly the partner I need to build the kind of life that justifies every risk we'll face together." The woman whose crash had shattered his carefully maintained solitude had indeed changed everything, not by rescuing him from isolation but by proving that some connections were strong enough to transform survival into something worth celebrating, and partnership into something worth whatever challenges the universe might present to test their commitment to each other. Marcus Kane had spent 20 years learning to exist without truly living, but Zara had taught him that the most important discoveries came from finding someone brave enough to help you remember who you were meant to be when you stopped being afraid of caring deeply enough to risk everything for love that transcended every boundary the galaxy could create.